The whispers started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremors before a major earthquake. For decades, the alliance between the United States and South Korea had been a bedrock of stability in East Asia, a bulwark against the rising tides of China and the unpredictable storms emanating from North Korea. It was an article of faith, etched in blood and forged in the crucible of the Korean War. But faith, as history has repeatedly shown, can be a fragile thing, and lately the winds of change have been blowing hard across the Korean peninsula. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic break, no declaration of independence or fiery denouncement. It was a slow, almost glacial shift, a drifting apart that began with a series of seemingly minor incidents, each one chipping away at the foundation of trust. The first crack appeared, perhaps surprisingly, not on the battlefield or in the halls of government, but on the factory floor. Imagine the scene. A Hyundai plant in Georgia, a symbol of American-Korean industrial cooperation, humming with activity. Korean engineers, skilled and dedicated, working alongside American laborers, a testament to the power of globalization. Then the hammer blow. President Donald Trump, in the throes of his anti-immigration fervor, singled out these very workers, branding them as foreigners stealing American jobs. The deportations that followed weren't just a policy decision. They were a deeply personal insult to South Korea, a public humiliation that resonated far beyond the immediate impact. Back in Seoul, the reaction was swift and visceral. South Korea's industry minister, in a private briefing, admitted that for the first time in 30 years of joint ventures, the Korean side felt unwelcome. Think about the weight of that statement. 30 years of partnership, of shared sacrifice and mutual benefit suddenly overshadowed by a single act of perceived betrayal. It was a turning point, a moment when the seeds of doubt were sown. The Trump administration, scrambling to contain the damage, tried to explain away the deportations as a reflection of internal politics, not foreign policy. But the explanation rang hollow, the damage was done. And then a new player entered the stage, President Lee Jae-myung, the newly elected leader of South Korea. A pragmatist with a keen sense of his nation's interests, Lee, unlike his predecessors, wasn't content to simply toe the American line. He saw the writing on the wall. A United States increasingly focused on its own internal problems, a global order in flux, and a China rising inexorably. He knew that South Korea couldn't afford to remain unconditionally dependent on Washington. So he began to explore other options, quietly opening diplomatic channels with Beijing. Publicly, the government framed it as a necessary step to secure economic stability. But behind closed doors, it was a clear message to Washington. South Korea had choices. It could chart its own course. The leaked reports from Seoul's foreign ministry, detailing a series of undisclosed meetings between South Korean and Chinese deputy ministers, sent shockwaves through the American intelligence community. The discussions centered on trade insurance mechanisms, a financial safety net designed to protect both nations from the fallout of American tariffs. But the real bombshell was the proposal floated by Beijing, a new framework of trust built on mutual supply chains for electronics, rare earth materials, and advanced battery components, a framework that would bypass American control altogether. This wasn't just about economics, it was about power, about influence, about the future of Asia. South Korea, long considered a loyal American ally, was now openly flirting with China. The whispers were growing louder. The Singapore Institute of Strategic Studies issued a stark warning. This went far beyond economics. It was a political signal, a quiet declaration that South Korea no longer intended to play the passive role in Washington's trade disputes. And then President Lee himself confirmed the shift. In an interview with JTBC, he declared, "We are grateful to the United States for decades of partnership, but the era of unconditional dependence is over. Korea must protect its own interests." The thunderclap reverberated across the Pacific. Trump predictably didn't take it well. His response, predictably, was a furious outburst on Truth Social, accusing Seoul of double dealing and threatening to reconsider America's military commitments on the Korean peninsula. It was classic Trump, impulsive, confrontational, and utterly devoid of diplomatic finesse. He was treating a long-standing ally like a disgruntled business partner, threatening to pull out of the deal if they didn't fall in line, but this time his bluster didn't have the desired effect. In South Korea, the reaction was one of weary resignation. Major newspapers like the Korea Herald and Hankuk Ilbo ran editorials criticizing Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy, his inability to see beyond the bottom line. One columnist put it bluntly: America had lost the ability to listen to its friends, becoming a nation that spoke only in ultimatums. While the diplomatic tension simmered, another revelation sent shockwaves through Washington. A high-ranking South Korean delegation, under the guise of attending an economic forum in Beijing, had secretly discussed the possibility of limited participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative. For Washington, this was a punch to the gut. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's ambitious infrastructure project spanning continents, was seen as a direct challenge to American influence. Seoul's potential involvement was a betrayal of everything the alliance was supposed to stand for. South Korean officials, scrambling to contain the fallout, insisted that they were simply exploring ways to gain economic advantages from China without formally breaking from the United States. But the explanation was wearing thin. As one unnamed lawmaker in Seoul reportedly said, if America imposes tariffs that cripple our exports and China offers open markets, what nation can afford to ignore the alternative? It was a brutally honest assessment of the situation, a clear indication of the difficult choices South Korea was facing. The tipping point, according to many observers, came in early October when Trump announced yet another round of tariffs against China, scheduled to take effect on November 1st. Among America's traditional allies, South Korea's reaction was deafening silence. Instead of publicly supporting the move, Seoul reportedly sent a private diplomatic message to Beijing expressing understanding of China's position. It wasn't an endorsement, but it was a clear signal. South Korea was no longer willing to blindly follow Washington's lead. It was preparing to redefine its place in the global order, to navigate the treacherous waters of great power rivalry with its own interests firmly in mind. Former U.S. Ambassador to Seoul, Mark Lippert, summed it up bleakly in an interview with CNN. The dynamic between the two nations has fundamentally changed. For years, China was viewed as a strategic threat to Korea. Now it's becoming a form of insurance against American unpredictability. He added that Trump's volatile trade and immigration policies had left many Asian allies questioning whether Washington might turn on them next. Trump treats allies like clients, Lippert warned, as if they can be replaced whenever it's convenient. Amid this growing distrust, Seoul began to expand its outreach not only to Beijing, but also to Moscow. South Korean officials were reportedly evaluating opportunities to collaborate with both China and Russia on energy development projects in the Far East. A few years ago, such an idea would have been unthinkable. Today, it reflected the changing reality of global power, the growing sense in Seoul that it needed to diversify its partnerships to ensure its own survival. The developments haven't gone unnoticed in Washington. Members of Congress have called for investigations into whether South Korea's new partnerships might breach intelligence sharing agreements. The White House is reportedly drafting new measures of diplomatic pressure, including potential reductions in funding for joint defense programs. But as analysts at the Brookings Institution have pointed out, each new threat only widens the gap, driving Seoul further into Beijing's embrace. At the same time, public sentiment inside South Korea is undergoing a major transformation. The younger generation, weary of relying entirely on American technology and protection, has begun to favor closer economic cooperation with China. A recent Gallup Korea poll revealed that nearly half of respondents believe the country should balance its foreign relations rather than depend solely on the United States. This attitude marks a generational shift, a growing desire for autonomy and self-reliance. Universities are buzzing with open discussions. The hot topic: how U.S. sanctions and trade wars are kneecapping the Korean tech industry. Meanwhile, television programs are openly questioning whether the United States is still a source of stability or if it has morphed into a force of volatility. The Lee administration is quietly putting the finishing touches on a long-term strategic blueprint, a vision for 2030 that dares to redefine China, not as a rival, mind you, but as an economic partner, a relationship built on measured trust. One of the key provisions in that document reportedly involves reducing the country's Achilles heel, its vulnerability to American sanctions. It's a flashing neon sign, a clear indication of just how much the mindset in Seoul has shifted. But across Asia, analysts are calling it the Second Asian Drift. The term refers to a slow but unmistakable shift of traditional U.S. partners toward a more balanced, multipolar alignment. After the Philippines started cozying up to Beijing, many experts now see South Korea as the next domino to fall. This emerging reality presents a serious headache for Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy. The Pentagon, ever vigilant, has already dispatched a quiet delegation to Seoul officially to discuss military coordination. But let's be real, their true mission was to convince South Korea to maintain its distance from Beijing. Professor Park of Korea University, however, believes such visits are too little, too late. The foundation of trust, he argues, has already crumbled. He told local media, with a hint of resignation, America is losing influence not through war or coups, but through policies that alienate its allies. Indeed, South Korea's economic miracle was largely built on American support. But as Washington pivots toward protectionism, Seoul now finds itself adrift in a world fractured by tariffs, trade barriers, and a brewing great power rivalry. If aligning more closely with Beijing allows the country to preserve stability and prosperity, many in Seoul see that as a pragmatic choice, not a betrayal. Several American think tanks are sounding the alarm, warning that unless Washington rethinks its tone and strategy, South Korea could become the first U.S. ally to formally embrace a multipolar partnership that includes China. In Beijing, officials appear ready to welcome Seoul with open arms. The Global Times has reported that policymakers are preparing to offer Seoul a special status in new regional economic frameworks. Behind the scenes, discussions are reportedly underway at the United Nations about a potential meeting between the foreign ministers of China, Korea, and Russia to outline a new model of cooperation, a trilateral alliance that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Meanwhile, CNN reports that Washington is planning to send a congressional delegation to Seoul to clarify its position, yet Korean commentators already doubt the visit will change much. The old alliance, once forged in the ashes of the Korean War, now stands at a crossroads, teetering on the brink of transformation. The partnership that once defined America's strength in East Asia is being tested by shifting loyalties, rising ambitions, and the cold, hard realities of economic survival. As if on cue, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that the long-awaited trade deal between Washington and Seoul would not be finalized during President Donald Trump's current visit to Asia. Speaking aboard Air Force One while en route from Malaysia to Japan, Bessent described the agreement as a complex project still being refined, though he insisted the overall framework was nearly complete. The deal, first outlined in July, included a reduction of tariffs on South Korean imports from 25% to 15% in exchange for Seoul pledging an investment of $350 billion, 0 cents, in the United States. According to officials, both sides were now focused on resolving the technical details that had slowed the process. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer explained that the deal encompassed far more than trade figures. It included national security provisions, technology cooperation, and the removal of non-tariff barriers that had restricted American companies in the Korean market. He added that new investment opportunities, particularly in shipbuilding, were being discussed as part of a broader strategy to strengthen industrial ties. Greer noted that South Korea was planning to expand its investments in U.S. shipyards, a move the Trump administration considered essential for reviving an industry once dominant in global manufacturing. Trump himself reinforced this sentiment, emphasizing the importance of restoring America's shipbuilding capacity to its former global leadership. The two leaders are expected to meet during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Busan, where the final terms of the trade pact may come under discussion. The upcoming meeting carries even greater weight because of Trump's scheduled encounter with Chinese President Xi Jinping immediately afterward. It will take place at a time when the world's two largest economies are attempting to prevent their escalating trade conflict from spiraling further out of control. And over the past months, both nations have imposed heavy tariffs on each other's exports, disrupting the flow of critical technologies and industrial materials. Although no one expects a breakthrough that would restore pre-2025 trade conditions, both sides have sought to maintain open dialogue in hopes of achieving modest progress before Trump's planned visit to Beijing early next year. Trade disputes have extended into the maritime sector as well. Washington recently imposed new port fees targeting ships built, owned, or operated by Chinese companies, claiming the measure would fund the revival of the U.S. shipbuilding industry. The move is expected to cost the top 10 global carriers an estimated $3,200,000,000 over the next year. Beijing retaliated swiftly by imposing its own port fees on American vessels and sanctioning several subsidiaries of a South Korean shipbuilder tied to U.S. defense contracts. These measures have already disrupted global shipping flows, driving freight rates higher and unsettling maritime logistics.